see. I think it's midnight in the UK. And one of the interesting things about Astrophilately is because everything is about the place and the time, the local place and local time. That's what determines what story you're telling. So in the UK, when we talk about the day that men first walked on the moon, that day is July 21st, 1969. But in the United States, we say it's July 20th because that's what time it is in Houston, which is controlling the event of walking on the moon. So yeah, so anyhow, welcome. My name is David Ball, and I've enjoyed astrophilately, astro being space and philately, telling the story with postage stamps, for a number of years. And so this is it's an introduction. And by the end of this presentation, you are going to know everything you need to know about astrophilately, and maybe you become a convert. So astrophilately is telling the story of the conquest of space, and it's doing it through postage stamps. So let's come up with a simple story. Let's say, for example, you wanted to tell the story of a space plane. So of, the space shuttle. So you would start out with a precursor, and in this case, it's the X-15 rocket plane. And it had powered flights between 1959 and 1968, 199 flights. And a lot of the ideas of energy management, of spacesuits, of reentry from outer space, things like that, were done by the X-15. So here, this is autographed by the pilot, Scott Crossfield. And it's got a pretty cachet on it. But the important thing here is September 17th, 1959 at Edwards Air Force Base, because that's where this event occurred. Now, if we wanted to create a space plane, we have to first do some proof of concept things. So here's an envelope for a different kind of plane called a lifting body. And it's kind of a bathtub design. This is the M2. And the thought was that if you were bringing a plane back from space, when you fly into the atmosphere, you're going very, very fast, and there's a lot of friction going through the atmosphere that heats up the surfaces, and it gets very, very hot. And it gets so hot, for example, that that when meteorites are coming from outer space, they burn up, right? And those are made out of solid rock. So you can imagine how hot this is. So if we have something as soft as an airplane with aluminum wings, we're going to have to do some very special things. And one of the thoughts was, well, the thing that's going to burn off is going to be the wings. So wouldn't it be great if we could have a plane where there was a significant amount of aerodynamic lift that came from the fuselage and not the wings? So a lifting body is a plane that doesn't have any wings. And then when you're designing the space shuttle, you need to do tests. So here are tests in wind tunnels of a 10% scale model. And this would be done out at Ames in California. And then you need to have the astronauts, they need to practice how to come back from space. Now, when you're landing the space shuttle, it's very different from either floating down in a capsule like in Apollo or flying an airplane. Because when you come back from outer space in the space shuttle, it's a glider. Well, it's a gliding brick, maybe. There's no power. You can't go around. So if you come down and you're a little high or a little long or something, you can't decide you're going to do a go around. You're landing. So, and you're going from 25,000 miles an hour, screaming around the Earth every 90 minutes, to landing on a runway at 110 miles an hour. So, and you only get one shot at it. So we need to do these crew simulations. So one of the ways they did this was they took a Gulfstream II jet, and they call it dirtying it up. So they created a bunch of pieces on the surface that and software characteristics which made it very difficult to fly, and gave it very poor glide characteristics. It essentially dropped like a space shuttle. So in this aircraft, you would have the astronaut pilot sitting in the left seat, and he would be flying this thing like it was the space shuttle. And you'd have somebody over on the right who's an instructor pilot. And in case he got into trouble, they could turn off that mode and fly the plane normally, or he could recover it in case there was some kind of a problem. So this is autographed by Richard Truly, who ended up becoming one of the NASA administrators. But he was someone who worked on the approach and landing tests. He was one of the first shuttle commanders, and Joe Engle, who flew the X-15 and also commanded the space shuttle. And then we start getting into flight test. So these are the approach and landing tests that were done with Enterprise. Enterprise was a full-scale space shuttle, but it never went into orbit. And it was designed for taxi tests, to be released off the back of a 747 and do glide tests. And so the last part, the landing part, was the part that they were able to do. And they had two crews. They had Hayes, who was on Apollo 13, and Fullerton, who was one of the test pilots for NASA, and Engel and Truly. And those were the two teams that did the ALT tests. And then we get to the first flight. So the first flight of the space shuttle was Columbia, and that was April 12th, 1961. And April 12th is kind of an interesting date, because exactly 20 years before that, Yuri Gagarin was the first man to fly into space. Now, in this case, the cachet here from the Radio Corporation of America is celebrating their participation in the space shuttle program. So we call this a contractor cover. So the cachet is one that's designed and paid for by the subcontractor, and they're celebrating their participation in the test. And here you can see April 12th, 1981, at the Kennedy Space Center, which is where the shuttle took off from. And so we would have a launch, right? Now, this happens to be the launch of STS-2. This is reusing Columbia for the first time, and this is November 12th, 1981. And there's Truly and Engel. So we'd also call this kind of a crew cover because it's signed by the crew. And you'd also have a landing cover, right? So now the launch cover was at Kennedy Space Center in Florida, because that's where it took off. But the landing cover, which was 2 days later, would need to be at Edwards in California, because that's where they landed. And initially, for these first flights, they weren't really operational flights. They were test flights. So these guys were wearing parachutes, and they were in ejection seats, and there were only the two pilots. They didn't bring a bunch of people with them. And they would land out at Edwards. And out at Edwards, you have these long, dry lake beds, and you could just land for miles. So you don't have to worry about a precision landing at an airport. So those first couple of tries, they wanted to make sure that they weren't going to have any issues. And after the first 4 flights, starting with STS-5, the space shuttle became operational. And at this point, you would have payload specialists, mission specialists, sometimes invited guests that would be flying on the space shuttle. And so you'd have a crew more than 2. Now, in this particular case, this was the first teacher in space, Crystal McAuliffe, and that crew. And this was January 28th, 1986. But if you'll remember, on this flight of the Challenger, this is the launch, but and by the way, parts of the shuttle are reusable. The orbiter is reusable, and so are the solid rocket boosters, which are on the side. The main big tank that burns up in the atmosphere, but as the solids come down and they land in the water, a ship will go out and it'll tow the solid rocket booster back, and it'll be refurbished and fired off again. But now, in the case of the Teacher in Space program, they had their own little patch, cachet. But we also remember it not just because it was the first teacher in space, but because it blew up. So it had a problem because they were trying to launch in very, very cold weather. And the seals, the rubber seals in between the solid rocket boosters weren't able to seal quickly enough with it being that cold, and hot gases went through and there was an explosion and everyone was lost. So this is a very rare cover, and this is helping to tell that story. So this was in a submersible out of Woods Hole, the Johnson Sea Link, and this was carried in the submersible that was looking for pieces of the wreckage from the solid rocket booster. So these are exceedingly rare. So astrophilately, the basics of what that means, it means the right place and the right date. So the right date is either the local time of the event, or let's say the post office is closed when the rocket takes off. It can be the next business day. And it needs to be the right place. And by that, we mean it's the closest post office to a controlling entity. So when I say a controlling entity, when they're going to the moon for the first time, the controlling entity would be the Kennedy Space Center, because that's where they're launching the rocket. But when they're walking on the moon, no one's doing anything controlled out of Florida anymore. It's now controlled out of Houston, Texas. So it needs a Texas postmark. And then when you're recovering the astronauts, you'd need it canceled on the ship that's picking them up, because they're controlling that event. So that's what I mean by the closest post office controlling that event. So let's take a look at an envelope and see what it is that we really need to tell this story. Now, this is a delightful envelope. This is from Gemini 4, which was the first spacewalk. This was Ed White walking in space and his commander, James McDivitt. So to an advanced astrophilatelist, you'd look at this and you'd say, this is very nice. It's not only a machine cancel from the prime recovery ship, the USS Wasp, which and that in and of itself is not rare, but the cachet is lovely. The artwork on the left. This is done by Morris Beck, and Beck had a service for Navy ships where I think you'd pay him a penny or 2 cents, and he would print this cachet on it, and you'd send it out to the ship, and you'd get the postmark. And so here you'd have this color cachet for this particular flight produced by Morris Beck. And for Morris Beck, he would have a number underneath the cachet. So it would say B438 or something like that. And that would tell you what ship it was supposed to be on. Now, there would be maybe 500 of these envelopes that were printed for each flight, but there were 25 that were not. There were 25 that didn't have a B number underneath. And he called them crew covers. And what he meant by that was that the envelope was given to the crew that were canceling on the ship as a thank you, to say thank you for doing this for collectors. So it turns out that even though there might be 500 of these that are printed, there were only 25 that didn't have a B number. So we'd call this a Beck crew cover. So it's a Beck crew cover on the prime recovery ship. It's autographed by the commander, and the label, we call that a VIP label, because somebody created a list of people to send these things to, as opposed to you writing your address. And so some of these have VIP labels. So it's a nice envelope. It tells a whole bunch of story, right? But I guess my question is, what on this, and it's got the right rate, it's got a 5-cent stamp on it. What exactly do we need on this envelope to tell this story? Well, you really don't need the autograph. We're telling the same story, whether McDivitt's autograph is theirs or not. Well, you don't need the address, and you don't need the cachet. Heck, you don't even need the stamp, right? All we really need is the postmark. You don't even need the envelope. If you could just have the postmark, you would be telling the story. You could tell the same story. You could say, what happened on the USS Wasp on June 7th, 1965? And the answer is, it was the prime recovery ship to pick up the first astronauts, first Americans to walk in space. So here's an example of pure astrophilately. Doesn't have a stamp on it, doesn't have a cachet, doesn't have an envelope. All it is a postmark. And the story of it is this. The post office asked the Apollo 11 crew that when they got to the moon, they took along an envelope and a canceling device, and they said, "We'd like you to have a ceremony on the moon where you postmark this letter and bring it back, and we'll put it in the National Postal Museum." Well, they're looking at the timeline, and Deke Slayton, who's the chief astronaut, he gets back to NASA and he says, we're only going to be on the moon for about an hour and a half. So we really don't have time to have a ceremony and, cancel your cover and stuff like that. But we'll take the cover with us. And at some point in the flight, because it takes 3 days to get out there and 3 days to get back, at some point, we will cancel your cover and we'll send it back to you. So they go to the moon, they land, it's successful, they're on their way back. And they go, "Oh yeah, we got to cancel that cover for the post office." And they have the canceling device, and they want to make a test strike. They want to make sure that they're pressing hard enough to make a nice cancellation. And they take the back of one of their flight plans, and they go ahead and make that impression. Moon landing, July 20th, 1969. Well, they made 3 impressions so that each one of the astronaut pilots could have one as a memento. And then they went ahead and canceled the cover, and the cover's in the Smithsonian. So this particular example was owned by Buzz Aldrin, and he sold it, and I think they sold it for $80,000 or $90,000. So, I mean, much of astrophilately is not expensive. There are some pieces that are quite nice, and this is certainly one of them. So let's talk a little bit about space event collecting. And that's kind of a pretty broad term, because when we talk about astrophilately is really about the rules required to exhibit in FIP. So when you're exhibiting, there are certain envelopes that are acceptable and others which are not. And that's what we're going to talk about now. So space event collecting. So there are first day covers. Okay, so we're looking at the one over here on the left, and it says landing of the Viking spacecraft on Mars. And over on the right, I just think this one is delightful. It's a picture of John Glenn, and there's Carolyn Kennedy, and she goes up to Glenn and she says, "Mr. Glenn, where's the monkey?" Because they were launching, monkeys before they launched astronauts. And so the question is, is either one of these acceptable in an astrophilatelic exhibit? And the answer is the one on the left, the one to Mars, is not. Okay, because you look at the postmark and it says Hampton, Virginia, July 20, 1978, and you say, well, what happened in aerospace history on that day at that place? And the answer is nothing. Okay, the only thing that happened on that day in that place was a stamp got issued. Okay, it's the first day of issue for a stamp. So even though the envelope has, a space theme to it, and you might be a topical collector or a thematic collector or doing a display class or something like that, it's not astrophilately, okay? Because astrophilately is telling a technical story about the conquest of space. And this envelope on the left is a first day cover that's just happens to have a space theme. Now, the one on the right, we're actually going to cut you some slack on, because even though it's a first day cover, it's a first day cover for the Project Mercury stamp, and that had kind of an interesting history. We weren't sure how well the mission was going to go, but we wanted to celebrate it. So the Postmaster General said, okay, let's produce a stamp, but we'll do it in secret, and we'll send it out to 305 post offices, and we'll put instructions on it not to open this up until we tell you. And so that's what the post office did. A whole bunch of post offices had these stamps. And when they knew that the astronaut pilot was safe on board the aircraft carrier, they let all the post offices know, and they said, Operation Hush Hush is over. There's a new stamp, open it up. And they saw, oh, it's a Project Mercury stamp, and they did these first day of issue. So in this case, this is canceled on February 20th at Cape Canaveral, Florida. And what happened on Cape Canaveral, Florida on February 20th? Well, John Glenn went into space. So that one, even though it's a first day cover, you can use that. Now, here are a couple of other examples related to the Apollo 1 fire in 1967. So over on the left, it's dated January 27th, 1967, which is the date of the fire. And those are actually very difficult to find because the fire happened at 6:30 at night and most post offices were already closed. So finding something that's a January 27th, 1967 Apollo 1 postmark is valuable. But look at where it's from. It's from Port Washington, New York. So you ask yourself, what happened on January 27, 1967 at Port Washington, New York? And the answer is nothing. Okay. It turns out that the people that made the cachet, they live in Port Washington. So that's where they went. You know, they went to their post office and got it canceled. So it's an unrelated place. Doesn't count. Now I'm looking at the one on the right. And now this one's at the Kennedy Space Center and it's January 27th. That's good, but it's a 20th anniversary cover. Okay. So in Astrophilately, we need to give you a little bit of a challenge. So if we said that anniversary covers were good, then you could just pick any old anniversary of some event and you'd be golden. So no, we're looking for that date and that place. So the one on the left, Port Washington, doesn't work. The one on the right, it's an anniversary cover. Now, when we talk about Markophily, when we talk about the postmark, the one on the left is Cape Canaveral, and it's a hand cancel, right? It's the circle date stamp is larger. And on the right, again, it's the same event. It's Cape Canaveral, December 4th. We're still talking about Gemini 7, but it's a machine cancel. Excuse me. Now, in addition to manned spaceflight, we're interested in the precursors. And we talked a little bit about the space shuttle and about the X-15, right? But there's stratospheric balloon flights. There are the V2 rockets from Germany. There are the X-planes, missile mail, all of this stuff. As long as it's technology that moves us into space, then it's all related. It's all important. It's helping us to develop the capabilities to create that conquest of space. So not propeller planes, not jet engines, because those require air, but anything that's a rocket engine, good to go. Now, there are other kinds of covers in addition to like the launch and the recovery covers. The one up here on the top is a tracking cover. So this is canceled for the last of the Apollo flights out in Australia. So you had to have worldwide tracking so that you could have telemetry. You could download the condition of the spacecraft. You could send instructions up to the crew. You could check your navigation. That's all done with the tracking station. And so they all had covers. The one on the bottom, NASA had a VIP viewing area, and they made up postcards. And they would give you up to 5 postcards, and you could mail them to people, and they would send them out on the day of the mission, and it would say, "Hi, I was at the launch of Apollo 10 here. This is the dress rehearsal for the first landing on the moon." And so those are collectible too. Then when you hear somebody talk about an insurance cover, these are kind of interesting. It turns out, being a pilot is a hazardous occupation. Being a test pilot, even more so. Being an astronaut, maybe more so than that. So it turned out it was difficult for them to get life insurance. And it turned out that they had to come up with a whole bunch of odd ways of getting these guys coverage so that their families would be taken care of. And one of the things is philatelic. So one of their friends, Al Bishop, said, if you'd like, I'll make up some cachets, some special ones that are just for the astronauts. You guys can sign these envelopes. We'll have them canceled on the day of the launch. And then if anything happens, the envelopes will be very valuable, and your families will be able to sell them, and that will, pay off the mortgage or put the kids through college. And so that's what they did. So this one over here is from Apollo 15, and it's signed by the guys. And then when the flight was over and they didn't need them, then they sold them or they gave them away. On the bottom is something called a captain's cover. So here the cachet was done by the print shop on board the aircraft carrier. The captain, who was in charge of the prime recovery ship, was proud to be selected to be in charge of recovering the astronaut. So they had their print shop make up cards. And the thing about captain's covers is you couldn't buy them. They were things that were handed out as favors. So if you were a VIP, you happened to be on the ship, or if you were a member of the crew, you could get these. And that's why they have value. And then there are envelopes that are flown. So this is one of 214 envelopes that were carried to the moon on the first mission to walk on the moon. And so it says up here, carried to the moon aboard Apollo 11. And it's signed by the crew. And these are rather expensive, even though there are, more than 200 of these, and all of them were saved, they still command at least $30,000 a piece. Now, if you got an eagle eye here, you're going to look at this and you're going to say, let's see, I'm going to look at the postmark. August 11th, 1969, Webster, Texas. So you say, well, what happened in Webster, Texas on August 11th that was important to aerospace history? And the answer is nothing. Okay. Now, Webster happens to be one of the closest post offices to the Manned Space Flight Center in Houston. So, okay, so the location is fine, but the question is what happened on August 11th? I mean, the mission got back on July 24th. So the mission was well over. But it turns out that these envelopes that were carried to the moon were in with the crew, and so they were delayed in quarantine. And when they finally got out of quarantine, someone took it to the post office and they got them canceled. So we say in Astrophilately that it needs to be the right place and the right time, unless you can't do that, in which case, do your best. So if, for example, you're on a ship and the ship doesn't have its own post office, well, then when you get back to port, the post office that's closest to the port, or you launch a rocket and it's, you're launching at 8 o'clock at night and there's no post office that's open. Well, the next day that it's open, that's an acceptable postmark. And in this particular case, even though, this is 3 weeks after the mission was already over, we're going to cut you some slack. If you want to show a $30,000 envelope that was on the surface of the moon, we'll let you.
There are more virtual Stampex talks coming to YouTube. Subscribe to our channel now so you don't miss out.
We'll actually give you rarity points for it. Are you ready for your quiz? Okay. So here's the first one. So here's an envelope, and this is from John Glenn's Mercury 6 flight, where he's the first American to orbit the Earth. And so the date says February 20th, 1962, which is the correct date. And so my question is, what's wrong with this picture? Okay. Now we're not worrying about the stamps, about the rate or about the cachet or anything like that. This is all about postmarks. And if you're thinking, well, what's Indian Rocks Beach? Well, that's close to Cape Canaveral, but it's not Cape Canaveral. So this is not something you could show, even though it's got the right date. Let's try another one. So here's one for an unmanned vehicle. This is for Pioneer 11, and it's a flyby for Jupiter, and it did the flyby. It reached Jupiter on December 3rd, 1974. So you look at the date and it says December 3rd, 1974. That's good. It's not an anniversary cover. But what's wrong with this picture? Now, if you're thinking, well, on December 3rd, 1974, what happened at the Kennedy Space Center? The answer is nothing, right? Because that was several months ago it took off. So it's being controlled by the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena. So if you're going to if you're going to tell the story of what happened on December 3rd, 1974, you need a California postmark. You can't have a Florida one. So that cover doesn't work either. Now this one's kind of tough. You're really going to have to think about this one for a moment. So in the Apollo program, initially they took off from Cape Canaveral, but the ones that went to the moon, the Saturn V rockets, those went from the Kennedy Space Center from Pad 39 A and B. So here's a cover, and it's autographed by Frank Borman, that's dated December 21st, 1968, which was the day that the Apollo 8 crew went to the moon. And the question is, what's wrong with this picture? So you're looking at it and you're saying, let's see, December 21st, 1968, Cape Canaveral. It's the wrong place. It needs to be the Kennedy Space Center. Now, what's interesting is Apollo 7, which just went around the Earth, they took off from Cape Canaveral. So if this was an Apollo 7 launch and it said Cape Canaveral, that'd be fine. But because this is a Saturn V rocket, it needs to say Kennedy Space Center. I guess what I'm saying here is when we're telling this story, and it's a very technical story, it's about the postmark. And that's, all this extraneous stuff about, it's got a sticker on it, or it's got a picture of John Kennedy, or, an autograph or things like that. That's all interesting. It's eye candy, but it's about the postmark. How about this one? So we know that the Apollo astronauts splashed down in the ocean, and they'd be picked up by helicopter. So here we have the splashdown for Apollo 12, and Apollo 12 came to rest in the ocean on November 24th, 1969. So the date is right, but what is wrong here? You're looking at that Cape Canaveral. Yeah, somebody got lazy, right? I mean, really what you wanted this canceled on the USS Hornet, because that's the ship that picked up the astronauts. So yeah, nothing happened on November 24th at Cape Canaveral. Now this one's a little little odd. This is actually not a problem with the postmark. There are a bunch of sounding rockets that we've been sending up from Virginia at Wallops Island for many years. And this was a flight, a joint scientific team between Germany and the United States. And it took off on July 14th, 1966 from Wallops Island. There's nothing wrong with the postmark. Okay, the postmark is fine. But I would not show this in Astrophilately. And can you imagine why? Can you think of what's wrong here? Well, if you're looking at that rocket, that looks like an awfully big rocket. That's a Saturn 1B. You would not have some behemoth like that taking off out of Virginia. I mean, we were sending up little sounding rockets. So that thing needs to be leaving from Florida. It's not going to leave from Virginia. So somebody got lazy and put some other picture there. And because we're trying to tell a story, a technical story, even though the postmark is correct, we wouldn't show this because we're going to confuse people. We're showing them a picture of something that wasn't the case. Now, this I thought was kind of interesting. So Alan Shepard, who was the first American in space, he passed away on July 21st, 1998. And so what's wrong with this picture? Well, first of all, in Astrophilately, we generally don't have like envelopes commemorating the death of people. I mean, this is about programs, right? This is about the launch or the recovery or walking on the moon or that sort of thing. So you look at this, it says Kennedy Space Center. Well, nothing happened on Kennedy Space Center on July 21st. He actually died I think in California. But there's something else that I looked at this and I just burst out laughing. Well, with the International Geophysical Year in 1957, America decided that we were going to send rockets into space. We were going to orbit stuff, and that's when Sputnik was, and Vanguard and Explorer and Discoverer and all our stuff. And then we started the manned space program, and we had the Mercury 7, and the first one was Alan Shepard. And you can see in the cachet, there's a picture of Alan Shepard's capsule sitting on top of a Redstone, which is an intermediate ballistic missile. But the funny thing is, look at the face. Look at the person there. That's not Alan Shepard. That's Yuri Gagarin. I mean, Alan Shepard would be rolling over in his grave to know that here we are, we're honoring Alan Shepard, but we're showing a picture of Yuri Gagarin. I mean, this is how sloppy people who don't really have an appreciation for space history can get. They just kind of see a picture of a guy in a spacesuit and they're like, oh, well, that must be Alan Shepard. Well, it's not, it's a Russian. How about this one? So this is, the night before Christmas, the Apollo 8 guys are orbiting the moon and they're reading from Genesis. And so this is dated December 24th, 1968, and it's canceled at the Cape. And at this point, you're all over this. You're looking at this and you're saying nothing happened at the Cape on December 24th, right? On Christmas Eve. So they were kind of lazy with that. I mean, if you wanted to get the right postmark, you'd have one canceled in Houston because Houston was controlling, the event while they're circling the moon. But what I just had to laugh is looking at the illustration. So take a look at that kind of closely. I mean, first of all, you see the moon has got, like it's got measles or something. It's got these enormous craters on it. So that looks kind of sloppy. But if you look at the spacecraft, you have the space capsule, and then you have the service module, and you can see the engine bell there in the back. But the capsule has been detached from the service module. And can you imagine if you didn't have that big engine to take you back to the Earth? I mean, if you detached around the moon, you'd be in bad shape. Why they did that, I have no idea. So let's talk about autographs. Autographs kind of spice things up. The one here on the left, Life magazine, when they realized who the first 3 pilots were going to be in the Mercury program, they called them the Gold Team, the first guys to fly. So that was going to be Virgil Grissom, Alan Shepard, and John Glenn. So I bought this envelope, and it's postmarked at Port Canaveral, which is acceptable, on May 5th, 1961, which was when the first Mercury astronaut took off. And it was autographed by John Glenn and also by Virgil Grissom. Now, Gus Grissom, in addition to being in the Mercury and Gemini program, he was also in command of the Apollo 1 mission that caught on fire on the launch pad, and he was killed. So his autograph is very valuable. So I get this envelope, and it's autographed by Grissom, which you can't get anymore, and John Glenn. The only one that was missing was Alan Shepard, and it was his flight. So I wrote to him and I said, could I send you this envelope? Would you sign it for me? And he said, sure. And I sent it to him. So it's got the Gold Team on it. It's got the right autographs. And over here on the right, this is a lithograph, which is kind of like a printed photograph. And it's got a bunch of signatures on it. What I want you to look at is over on the left where you see the Alan Shepard autograph. Look at the P in Shepard, okay? It's got the rounded part, and then it's got the line that goes down. Now I want you to look at the Alan Shepard, who's the second from the right in the lithograph. So it says Alan B. Shepard Jr. Can you see the P? It's got a line that goes above the circle. Well, one of his secretaries, it was not uncommon for these guys, because they'd get lots of autograph requests, for the secretaries to just sign their names and send it back. And it's a real disappointment if you're really trying to get authentic autographs. And there's a whole business about determining whether something's authentic and whether it's an auto pen, whether it's a forgery, whether it's printed, rubber stamped, secretarial. In this particular case, if you see an Alan Shepard and there's a line above the P, it's a secretarial. It's not his signature. So here's an interesting situation. The cover, the lower cover, has a signature for Gus Grissom, and it's canceled on the Randolph, which was the ship that picked up Grissom after his suborbital flight. And I get contacted by a woman who wants to sell me this envelope, and she says, "You know, this is very valuable." And I looked at it and I said, "Yeah, I believe it is." And she says, "Look, it's signed by the astronaut, and that's why it's valuable." And I told her, you know, that's really not the case. I said, what you have here is an auto pen. It was a mechanical device that signed it just the way the pilot would sign it. And so when you look at the Gus Grissom over on the left-hand side, and it looks the same as the one on the right, it was done by a mechanical device. I said, you know, that it's worth $5, you know, doesn't have any value. I said, on the other hand, to an astrophilatelist, so to an autograph collector, it doesn't have any value. But to an astrophilatelist, this is a very valuable cover because there are very few examples of the USS Randolph from July 21st, 1961. So I ended up paying her good money, and actually about the amount of money that she was looking for, but not for the reason she thought. So here you can see over on the left, this was, there's a Beck, but it's a rubber stamp. So if you didn't pay to have a color one done, on the ship, they would just use a rubber stamp that looked the same. And it's the prime recovery ship, the USS Intrepid, on March 23rd, 1965. And that one's nice because it's signed by the captain up on top. And sometimes it's a printed signature. Like these, you know, some people will be all excited because they'll say, "Oh my God, I got something valuable," and they're nice. Okay, they're nice, but they're nice because of the postmarks, because of the May 5th, 1961, or being on NOAA, the February 20th on the ship. And then there's the scourge that is Charles Reiser. So Reiser had a company that he sold space covers, and he sold some wonderful material, lots of rare things, common things, solid dealer. But what ended up happening was he would get lots of requests for rare things, and at some point he kind of went off to the dark side, and he started producing his own hand cancels. And so he is forging the postmarks. Now that happens to be a federal crime, but you can see those postmarks are actually pretty easy to do, probably easier to do than autographs. So this is a Reiser forgery, and he did almost all of his forgeries on postal stationery, sometimes adding a stamp to it, but generally just on postal stationery. And one of the hallmarks, in addition to it being postal stationery, is if it was addressed to a guy named Shade in Washington, D.C., that was to Reiser. And so these are all bad. So even though this cover with these autographs could be a couple of $1,000s, I paid $25 for this, and I bought it because of my interest in it as a Reiser forgery, not because I think the autographs are real. I don't. I think they're fakes, and because I know the postmark is not right. And some people will collect different cachets. So on the left, spacecraft, they did wonderful, very detailed, very scientifically correct examples. And so I love collecting the spacecraft ones. And here, Patrick Air Force Base, July 21st, 1961, that's Gus Grissom's flight. And Patrick Air Force Base is considered an acceptable launch location. So that's great. Over on the right, Bendix, that was another one of those contractor covers because Bendix did a lot of launch support work. So they had a whole series of cachets, and that was canceled on the day of the launch. And that beautiful 1331, 1332 Setenant from 1967 of Ed White walking in space. Over on the left, that's velvetone. So that's flocked. So there was a guy named Richard Rank, and he printed cachets, and then he took kind of fuzz and some adhesive and put the fuzz over it and baked it in his oven. And he would make, I think, maybe 50 of these. So those are collectible. People like those. Those are kind of fun. And then the lower one was done at the Kennedy Space Center. So for some of the Gemini launches and the Apollo launches and a little bit after that, actually from 1965 to 1975, the Kennedy Space Center for important events would have a rubber stamp, an official rubber stamp that would go out on the day that that the event occurred. So those are nicely collectible. Goldie did wonderful work there on the left. I sent that off to Scott Carpenter, and his handwriting at that point starting to have some Parkinsonian aspects to his signature, but it's still kind of cool to have the astronaut's autograph on it. Flick was one of the early producers of covers, sometimes in color, and this one was from Discoverer One, and Discoverer was code for the CIA that was trying to do reconnaissance work from orbit. So this was done in 1959. This was from the first Discoverer launch. And there you can see the Beck printed over on the left, and that's a primary cover ship off the Lake Champlain. And you can see over there on the left is the B number, you know, and that's on all of the printed ones, with the exception of those 25 for the crew. Some people did hand painted. So Numeroff, Bill Numeroff, who worked for the World Telegram and Sun, liked to do airbrushes. So this is one from one of the monkey flights, and he would do just a couple. So this might be one of 3, one of 5, and so those are nicely collectible. Centennial, which not only did a lot of space ones, but they did lots of them for a couple of decades. And that particular one is for the Manned Orbiting Laboratory, which was the Air Force version. They were trying to get into the space business in 1966. And the one on the right is a lot of fun. So this is from STS-8. This is from Challenger. And what they did was the post office worked with NASA and sent up about 500,000 of these envelopes. And they're beautifully postmarked about the launch and the return to Earth, and they sold them in the post office for $15 in a nice little folder. And because they produced 500,000 of these things, you can find them on eBay for 10, 20, 30 bucks a piece. And I calculated how much it cost to send that envelope into space. It cost $250 to send it into space. You could have bought it for $15 in 1983, and now you can buy it on eBay for about the same price. So if you want something that's really astrophilately, something that's been in orbit, been in outer space, been on the Space Shuttle Challenger, you should go on eBay and find one of these covers. And like I said, there are hand-painted add-ons. So these are 2 examples. The one on the right, a monkey flight, and the one on the bottom was capturing one of those orbiting reconnaissance satellite film packages. What happened in these 2 cases was I had envelopes that I bought that had the postmark, but they didn't have any cachet. So it really didn't give you context. So when you go to my exhibit and you see January 31st, 1961, yes, you can read about it and you can see that it was Ham and he was orbiting as a monkey. But how much nicer is it when you add something to the cover, you give it some color and, you know, some visual interest. There are a number of wonderful references. Steve Durst has done a series, a book, Project Mercury, one on Gemini and one on Apollo. And so he's done American work. Jim Reichman, who retired from space operations. He worked for the Air Force. For some reason, he is into the Soviet stuff. And he sent me one of his works, and it was all on a CD, and it was all like ready to be published. And I said, well, where can I buy this? And he says, oh, I just do it for myself. And I said, well, let me publish it. I'll micro publish it for you. So what I do is I'll print maybe 6 copies of the book, or I'll have some that are just CD only, and then when I run out of those, I print another 6, and I've got 40 or 50 titles from Reichman. So I mean, it's unbelievable. As much information as there is about American astrophilately, there is so much more about Soviet astrophilately, and this guy has done that. And then I have a book called American Astrophilately, and it's been very well received. And what I like about the book, it really has 3 sections. The first section is telling people different aspects of collecting. So there might be a section on what are captain's covers, or what are insurance covers, or that sort of thing. And then the middle section are examples of what you can show. And they show you who the manufacturer of the cachet is and whether this is astrophilatelically correct. And then the last section is a guide that has postmarks in it. So when you go to a stamp show and you pick up an envelope and it says that it's on the recovery, it was part of the recovery force for a particular flight, there's nothing on it that tells you whether that was a secondary ship, and there might have been 20 or 30 secondary ships, or the primary recovery ship, which is really the only one that has any value. So if you get a secondary recovery ship cover, it's worth $1. And if you get a primary recovery ship cover, it's worth $10. So in the back of this book, it has the postmarks and and it shows you a picture of the name of the ship, but it's only for the primary recovery ships. So you could take this book with you when you go to a stamp show, and if you were looking for, the right covers, you would go to the back of this book and you'd say, no, I'm looking for the one that says WASP on this date, and you'd have that. So if you have an interest, go to www.americanastrophilately.com. And at my website, in addition to, I really created the website so that I'd have a place to offer this book. It's also been offered in NASA gift shops. It's been on Amazon. It's been on eBay, things like that. But I offer it on this website. So in addition to that, I offer Jim Reichman's stuff and Steve Durst's stuff and a lot of my duplicate covers. I have my exhibits up there. You can see what examples of Americans in space looks like, the exhibit, articles, a bunch of different stuff. So if you have an interest in astrophilately, let me encourage you to go to www.americanastrophilately.com and check it out. And let me stop sharing. Wow, that's a lot of talking. Okay.
Thank you very much. Oh, wait a minute, flash in, flash out. If anyone has any questions, please put that in the Q&A box for us. Thank you very much, David. That was fun as well in places. Love the quiz and all the sloppy designs of just people like churning covers out without thinking about it. And really interesting to think of astrophilately as, it's not thematic collecting. When you brought it down to it's just the postmark, that's the important thing. So maybe it's in your book, but it sounds to me like, you need to know all of the dates and you need to know what postmarks you're looking for when you're hunting out material, rather than hunt the material out and then be like, oh, is this relevant? So I guess you have to do so much more research ahead of browsing and shopping for items.
Well, it's not as onerous as it sounds.
Okay.
I will say that if you go on eBay and you put in space covers, you'll get 40,000 entries.
Yeah.
Okay. And 3/4 of them are ones that you cannot show. All right. They're junky covers. So at some stamp show, they decided that they were going to put a rocket on their cover, and they called it a space cover, So the whole object here is to be able to tell the story of the exploration of space. So for somebody like me, I like reading books that are written by astronauts or histories that were done by NASA. And with the internet, it's very easy to, if you typed in and you said Project Mercury, it would show you a list of the 7 days, the dates that you're looking for. So yes, you do have to think about it.
Yeah.
You can't just pick up a cover and say, well, this will probably fit in the exhibit. It won't.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
a little bit of a challenge.
Yeah, it's great. And so you mentioned that I can't remember if it was before we opened the call to everybody, but about Astrophilately being, it's a new relatively new class. Is
Oh,
it
it is.
very newest class? One of the newest classes.
It's certainly one of the newer ones. It's I would say maybe 30 years old.
Okay.
It's relatively new, yeah.
Yeah. And the question is it a small area? Is it that there's a small number of people interested in this area, or is it because there's limited material? So if we had too many people collecting in the area, there'd be too much competition for the items.
Yeah.
Is that a factor? Is that the items are hard to come by and it's maybe put a barrier to people wanting to enter this area, or do you think there's a lot of stock out there?
Well, it's generally not a problem, although there are certainly choke points, right? And part of it has to do with how much space is in our everyday lives. So uh, I was 10 years old when they walked on the moon. Okay, I was born in '59, and so I grew up watching the astronauts go into space and explore, and that was wildly interesting, And we wanted, they were our heroes, and we wanted to be astronauts. And when I put on my snow pants and my gloves and stuff, I was actually putting on my spacesuit before I went out into the snow, and so space was very much on your mind. Um, when we transitioned after Apollo, after we stopped going to the moon, we did the Skylab thing for a while, and then we did the space shuttle. And the space shuttle is just a big truck, all right? And all it did was it went to orbit. It went up 200 miles. It went around, a lot, and we did that 135 times. So, okay, how excited can you get about that? And I love stuff that's space, but I can't really get excited about that. So, and we built a space station, and that's been pretty cool. And that's been in continuous operation for like 30 years. So that's great. But I think what happens is there was a great deal of excitement with Sputnik. There was a great deal of excitement with the Mercury program and with Apollo walking on the moon. I think it trailed off a lot when we got to the shuttle. There's a lot more shuttle material out there, but I just don't think it's as interesting. And what's becoming really interesting now is the advent of commercial space. So now we have Blue Origin, and we have Orbital Science and Bigelow and SpaceX, and these people that are doing all kinds of unbelievable stuff. And we went from, we haven't been to the moon in 50 years. Okay. And if we wanted to go to the moon today, we couldn't do it. Okay. The technology doesn't exist because the people that kind of handcrafted these things and knew exactly how to make this kind of stuff, they don't exist. Okay. I mean, we've got blueprints and stuff, but it's really that hard. So we're developing that new infrastructure. And now with Elon Musk and SpaceX, I am such an incredible fan of, and whatever you think about, his politics and him as a person, that company and what they're doing is just unbelievable. And when he says, we're going to be on Mars in 5 years.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, when we walked on the moon, a reporter put up their hand and said, when are we going to be on Mars? And the answer was in 10 or 15 years.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And ever since then, the answer has always been 10 or 15 years because we never kind of committed to it and put the money into it. But when Elon Musk says we're going to be on Mars in 5 years, I really believe that. Now, in terms of the amount of material, I saw an envelope that I bought on eBay, and I paid $1,600 for it. Okay, it was from May 5th, 1961. It was Alan Shepard's recovery ship. Now, the Apollo 11 one, you can get on eBay. They had 250,000 of them canceled on the ship on that day in 1969. So you can go on eBay right now, and for $5, you can get the one that was canceled on the ship that picked up the Apollo 11 astronauts, $5. But if you want to get the one from Alan Shepard, there were only 44 of those.
Yeah.
So, so the question is, is it hard to find the material? Generally not, but there are a couple of little choke points, and like that's an example of a choke point.
That's very interesting. And I like the example you gave as well about I can't remember if you said it was 1 million or 500,000 covers that they sent up on a mission, and that to actually just the weight of that, when you said, I was like, what? I mean, do they send stuff up nowadays? When was the last time they sent kind of covers up that were signed or?
Oh, that was a one-time deal.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So it's always cost, until SpaceX, it's cost $10,000 to send a pound and put it into orbit.
Yeah.
A pound of envelopes is 40 envelopes. So if you have $10,000 to lift a pound and you got 40 of them, it's costing you $250 to lift that envelope.
Yeah.
So here they are, they're lifting, and there's also there's a $10 stamp on there, and they had to print the envelope. So
So we got a question here is, do you think, this is a good one because you've already kind of given us an idea of when you think we might be on Mars. And I remember visiting, I'm trying to think what year it would have been. It probably would have been like 2020. I went to the Johnson Space Center and went into the control center, the place they said where they're gonna, amazing, absolutely amazing. And they said 5 years. When I was there, like 2020, they said that they would start to be thinking about it. Anyway, the question is do you think that the USPS will still be issuing postage stamps by the time we get to Mars?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Do you think that we're gonna have that maybe, who needs to speak to Elon and say that this would be so cool if we put some covers up onto that?
Oh, I would think that they'll take some to Mars. Now I will say, for people that have an interest, Jeff Bezos will take covers. If you want to send him a postcard, he'll take it up on his rocket. So I have a couple that have gone up on his New Shepard rocket, his suborbital one where he takes tourists up.
Yeah.
If you send him a postcard, so Google Blue Origin postcard, and they have something called Club for the Future, and it's to try to get young people excited about space. And what they say is, take a postcard, draw a picture on it or something, send it to us. We'll put it in the rocket. We'll cancel it, saying, that it's been in space, and we'll send it back to you. So no charge.
I don't know about anybody else who's listening to this live or who is listening to this on demand at Virtual Stampex or is listening to this on YouTube for the many months to come. I'm definitely doing that.
Oh yeah, you should.
He's going to get everyone from Virtual Stampex is going to be in touch now.
Oh yeah, no, it's
and have a postcard.
It's great.
We'll have there's a whole category then about all of us sending stuff up.
Yeah, so here I'll show you. So can you see that?
Yeah.
Let me take it out of this. So yeah, so this blue right here is the mark that shows that it's been in space. So
cool.
I made up a little postcard. At the time, there was a lot of COVID going on. And they were doing virology experiments and stuff in space. So I sent them this postcard, and they sent it up with the rocket.
That's cool. Next question: are there any specialist auction houses or specialist shops that you would, or specialist actual auctions? Like, does this stuff come up, or do you have to kind of hunt around within other auctions, or like you say, on eBay for most of the material?
You have to hunt around. I will say that Heritage in Dallas, Texas, has a space auction that's going on now that's going to close in a couple of weeks, and it has some really nice space material in it. I work as a describer for Kelleher in Connecticut, and I try to encourage them to have a lot of aero astro stuff, but you just kind of have to look around for it.
Yeah. Okay, have we got any other questions? If anyone wants to ask anything, ask now.
Or forever hold your peace.
Well, we've all got your details of your website now, so we know how to
Oh,
get in touch with
you
you.
should definitely go and look at it because it's got some interesting videos there. It's got, bunches of articles and things like that. It's all astro all the time.
Fantastic. Well, I think that's us for today. Thank you so much, David. That was fascinating and fun. And I hope it's inspired some people to look into the category. Is there anything you'd like to say before we close?
Yeah, I can't believe that you're as bright and bushy-tailed. What time is it? It's 1 o'clock in the morning?
Yeah, but it's philately. It's energizing, isn't it? It's like a
That's right.
drug.
You
It's
get
a drug.
energy from philately. I don't know what it is, but I
Caffeine
just
and
want you to know
philately.
you have done a wonderful job with PTS and Stampex. I mean, this has been great. I've really enjoyed the roundtables. I've enjoyed, visiting the dealers. I enjoyed the opportunity to talk about space. So thank you.
Well, thank you. The show wouldn't be, well, we wouldn't have a show if it wasn't for speakers like yourself and contributors like yourself. So thank you so much.
Sure.
And thank you to everyone who's attended. We hope to see you at another talk or roundtable soon. Thank you.
Good night. Sleep well.
Good night.
There are more virtual Stampex talks coming to YouTube. You know what to do. Click subscribe now so you don't miss out. See you soon. We hope to see you at our next Stampex show. At Virtual Stampex or in person in London.